So, Kim, I know we're not talking about books today for once, although it does, so we probably will end up talking about books at some point. But I can't help notice that we do have some of the same books behind us.
Well, we have very good taste. So
Clearly.
inevitably, yes. Yeah, I've got my beautiful Pan editions, which were the first editions I ever bought from Russia with Love in Pan. Was my first ever Bond purchase. And then the Folio Society were incredibly generous and gave me the full
Oh,
collection as a thank you for writing the introduction to the Casino Royale folio, which they did send me, and I have literally held once because I find it such a nerve-wrackingly beautiful object. I know that's really silly.
so this was my birthday present last year.
Oh,
My
what a
very
good present.
generous husband. Yes. So, to be
So you
honest,
can look at it without feeling nervous.
it's only come out the
Oh,
wrapping
so beautiful.
once, so I could read your
Oh.
introduction. And also take a photo of it next to one of my cats, which then the Folio Society asked for permission to use in their publicity. So, my cat is Insta. Yeah,
The highest level of fame.
indeed. Yeah, so the Pan ones were my first ones as well, actually. They were actually that side of the room. So yeah. Bond is
Nice.
kind of spreading across this room. It's it was there, now it's there, and it's also there. And yeah, so it's a yeah. I might need a
You're being
specific
pincered.
room fairly soon.
Yeah, that wouldn't be strange at all.
No, not at all. So we're not here to talk about books today. We're here to talk about four men whose names all start with the same letter, conveniently, for the titling of this episode.
Yes.
So we're talking about Baker and Bond, obviously, and Benson, not Raymond Benson, a fictional character in Bond, not the real person. And finally, Bray. So that's who we're talking about today. And of course, the first person is the person who links all four of those together. So George Baker, which many of the people watching or listening to this will already know, was your grandfather.
Yeah, that's right. So George was an actor and a writer, and lots of listeners will be familiar with his work. And he has this kind of long-running James Bond connection, um, which begins with Ian Fleming trying to cast him as Bond, which I think we'll come on to and talk about in a little bit more detail. And then continued as he appeared in a few Bond films. And then his most iconic role probably is Ruth Rendell's Inspector Wexford, so another kind of icon of the crime genre. I didn't know any of this growing up. He never talked about it. I think because for him, he's really fond of his Bond connection, but for him, it felt like a million years ago. For me, as a diehard Bond fan growing up, it wasn't until one year we were at his house for Christmas, and I was given a book about the history of James Bond for Christmas. And I was flicking through it, and there was a picture of him standing next to Roger Moore. And then I read it, and there was this whole section on him. And I ran downstairs to the kitchen and said, "You never told me you were in James Bond." And I was furious. And he sort of laughed and said, "Oh, darling, so long ago." But I made him, tell me about it. And he had really fond memories of it. And he was a really influential figure in my childhood. He was sort of my father figure in lots of ways. And part of that was his love for the arts, for drama, for poetry, for the history of literature. And he really encouraged my, I guess, love of learning and curiosity, which wasn't something that was necessarily encouraged at my school, paradoxically. So he was, in that way, and in many other ways, a really major influence on my development as a writer.
No, that's beautiful. Thank you for sharing that. And it was your idea to do this particular episode in this way. We're tying this in with the first hopefully first of many Sir Hilary Bray days, which there's a long story behind the gestation of that, which if you have no idea what Hilary Bray Day is, then check out an earlier episode with Rosie Sherwood, your sister, in which we unpick that and my growing obsession with tweed, thanks to your sister. So, and quite a few people in the James Bond communities now growing obsession with tweed as well. I tell you what, it's one of those things,
I love it.
you notice tweed in a James Bond, you talk about tweed and then you just notice tweed in a Bond film. So as I was going back through on a Majesty Secret Service earlier today, I couldn't help noticing quite how many characters. I think that's the most tweedy Bond film of it all, that your grandfather has his biggest Bond role in. Yeah. Was he actually
Yeah.
I
And he
didn't
was
did he like tweed himself? Was he that sort of dresser? Because
he
I've seen
did actually.
he wore a suit well, let's put it that way. But did he like tweed
He,
outfits?
yeah, he wore a suit very well, and he really took to country life, and he had a lot of, you know, really lovely tweed jackets, very much in the kind of country style. I say took to because he was considered by a lot of people the quintessential English gentleman. I remember one of my teachers saying to me, "Oh, he's the quintessential Englishman," when I was growing up. It was sort of a surreal way to have a grandfather in some ways growing up, because I remember all of my teachers had massive crushes on him at school because Wexford was on and it was so big, and he was kind of considered this sex symbol.
Mm-hmm.
But he was my grandfather, so it was very peculiar. And people had this image of him as this kind of quintessential Englishman, but he actually grew up in Bulgaria. His father was the consul to Bulgaria. I think that's the right title. So he grew up there. He grew up mostly speaking Bulgarian, and he hadn't really, I don't think he'd even visited England before they had to move here because of the war. And that was a major dislocation and trauma in his life. He had to leave behind the world that he knew, the home that he knew, the nanny who'd really raised him, and alongside the help of who'd helped his mum. Let's put it that way. His mum had a lot of mental health issues, which at the time there wasn't really support for. So that was his childhood, and then war breaks out. His father has to go. I have a suspicion his father was a spy. I need to get down to the National Archives to confirm this, but his father leaves on mysterious diplomatic work and says goodbye to them at the railway station. And the last thing he said to George was, "Take a woman by the waist and a bottle by the neck and you'll be fine," which was advice he pretty much followed for the rest of his life. Perhaps not the best of parting words to give to a young man. But that was the last time he saw his father. He died in unknown circumstances in the war. He then flees across Europe with his mother and his younger siblings. His mother took him to the Moulin Rouge in Paris just before it fell to the Nazis, because she felt that he ought to see it in case it never existed again. I think he was only 12. So this is his education. Then he arrives in Yorkshire, not really speaking or reading or writing in English. His school considered him, well, in their words, a dunce, and thought he was illiterate and sort of neglected to give him any kind of education. So he was really self-educated. He loved poetry, especially, and he was soaking it all up himself. And he was trying to, I think, find a lineage to belong to, find a world that he could belong to. And that very quickly became the world of theatre. So age 13 or 14, he leaves school. He's already 6'2" by that point. He was 6'4". So he's already shot up. People took him to be 18, and he joined a repertory theatre, and ended up supporting his whole family as an actor from a very young age. Where he really was the sort of breadwinner and protector for the family the minute they arrived in England. So he didn't have a childhood in lots of ways. So he then remade himself, and some of this will sound familiar to people if you've read my first novel, Testament, which kind of pulls on some of the threads of George's life. he remade himself in the mold of an English gentleman, and he went and took elocution lessons to learn the Queen's English, to speak with a received pronunciation accent, which was considered necessary for actors at the time. And he became a man of the countryside, and he had tweed jackets, and he rode horses, and he seemed like he'd been here forever. But in many ways, that was a role he'd learned. And then at the very end of his life, he had 10 strokes at the end of his life, and just kept recovering from them. He was really an ox of a man. But after one of the strokes, he stopped speaking English, and we thought he was speaking nonsense. And then the nurse said to us, "Oh, I didn't realize he was Bulgarian." And we all said, "Oh, he's not Bulgarian, he's English." And she said, "Oh, well, he's speaking perfect Bulgarian," which he hadn't spoken since he left Bulgaria during World War II. And we had no idea he had any memory of, but his mind after the stroke returned to that language rather than to English. And so this nurse was having completely fluent conversations with him in Bulgarian, which was a really moving thing to see. So in some ways, the George Baker that people think they know, the George Baker who wears tweed and has that very kind of crisp English accent, is the role of a lifetime.
Wow. And no spoilers for Testament. I forgot to tell you this before we started recording. I actually reread Testament about 3 weeks ago. Having then,
that's nice.
I read Testament first, and then I read Double or Nothing, then Wild and True Relation. See, we're talking about books already. We're not supposed to talk about books, but we're talking about books. And then, of course, I've read A Spy Like Me, but then I went back to Testament. And it's really interesting when you've read books by an author, and then you go back to what they've done earlier. And obviously, we've got to know each other as well. You do read them quite differently. And I was really struck on my reread in Testament, that thread throughout of forming a British identity, which is there in definitely Double or Nothing. Is a big part of that as well, the first of your 00 novels. And I love the part where I know that the characters aren't strictly analogous. In Testament, they draw on your family's experiences, but unless you're going to say otherwise, that certain characters are certain people. But they're like, is it right to say about amalgamations of different characteristics and that kind of thing? Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think that when you're writing, or for me anyway, writing that novel, I was processing my grief for George. He just died when I began writing the book. And that grief carried into the character of Joseph Silk. But that character is also separate from George, and also draws on the other side of my family history, the Jewish side of my family. So I think amalgamation is a good word. And it really was a way to process losing him, because he'd been I was very, very blessed and lucky to have him in my life, and he'd been such an influence on me and such a father figure for me. And he'd really noticed that I loved reading growing up. I was desperate to learn. I was desperate to get my hands on anything I could, and my school wasn't really it was a fine school, but it was more concerned with teenage pregnancies than whether I knew anything about 17th century poetry. So, fair enough. But it left me really hungry. It left me wanting more. And George recognized that in me. And because he was self-educated, he kind of knew how to go about it. And he would send me books to read, and he would talk to me about poetry, and we'd go on these long walks where he would say, "But have you looked at it this way?" Or, "Well, do you know this writer?" And that would kind of direct me onto the next thing. And he would always read my work and be so encouraging. And he really believed that I could become a writer. And that's such a big thing for something like this, to have somebody who really believes in you and makes you feel like it's possible. And he had this real sense of kind of giving me permission to, I don't know, to be me, which is the greatest gift someone can give you, really. There's been a lot in the news recently about the Garrick Club, which is this men's only gentleman club in London, which to American listeners might sound salacious. It's a club with overstuffed chairs and a library rather than anything else. But it's men's only. And George had his 70th birthday there. But he has 5 daughters and granddaughters. So he had it in the room that allows women. There's one room there that on certain days of the year allows women, and that's where he had it. And we got there and we were told that as women, we couldn't go up the main staircase in the club. We had to go up the back staircase. I was 14 and took against this. So during the party, when everybody was busy, I thought, I'm going up the main staircase. So I crept out. No one was around, I thought. And I'm climbing up this main staircase. And then this butler-looking man, footman, appears at the top of the stairs and says to me very politely, "Oh, Ma'am, you're not really allowed on the main staircase. Can I ask you to go back down?" And I was just getting ready to apologize. And then from the bottom of the staircase, my grandfather's booming voice roaring, "My granddaughter can do whatever the fuck she likes." A few drinks in at this point. And I looked behind me and he'd been standing at the bottom of the stairs watching me go up it the whole time and hadn't told me to stop. So whenever I'm nervous or I'm doing something that is a little bit scary, I always remember that and think, yeah, my granddaughter can do whatever the fuck she likes. So he had that real sense of kind of telling me to be brave and to spread my wings. And he always had this energy about him where I felt, I guess, held by him. I remember he did This Is Your Life, which he hated. This Is Your Life is a TV show where they kind of parade your whole biography before you. But as I was talking a little bit about his childhood, people will have picked out he didn't in some ways have the easiest of lives. And he also had 3 wives, complexities there. I used to tell him he was half of a Henry VIII, which of course he loved. So there was a lot of kind of family stuff which you wouldn't necessarily want to unpack live on national TV.
Mm-hmm.
And he'd always told people, do not let them do This Is Your Life on me, because it's a surprise. People, they would just, they tell you it was a party and then it would turn into a TV show. But it happened. This Is Your Life happened to him. And we had to go along. And we were really little. This is like one of my earliest memories of being backstage at a TV studio. And I had to wear a dress, which I wasn't, I've always been what we called a tomboy growing up. We probably don't call it that now. But I remember not being a massive fan of the idea of wearing this dress. And also being quite scared to go on TV. I think I was about 4, maybe, let's say. And being backstage and I could hear what was happening on stage, and I could hear all the clapping and cheering, and I could see the lights, and I could see George, and it was a bit nerve-wracking. And then they said, okay, out you go, and we were going to go out and surprise him on stage. And then I just remember him picking me up and holding me, and from that moment on, being in his arms, it felt like the most fun thing in the world to be on stage with him and to be with him in this moment where he made it something almost like not a game necessarily, but it was like he was inviting us into the ring that he was inside, and we were in the moment with him. So he had that way of inviting people in. He was this amazing host. He invited people in, and he could make you feel very safe around him. And losing that encouragement and that safety of his love when he died was like my world turning upside down in lots of ways. So writing Testament helped me externalize that grief and find a container for it and a way to process that loss and thank him for everything that he gave me in my life.
It's funny, the story you've just shared about him being at the bottom of the stairs watching you sneak into a male-only area, which I love, by the way. You know by now how much that story. Thank you for sharing that with me. That story is going to stick with me. It reminds me of that moment in Testament or I think all of your books have got moments like this where you've almost got the I hate the term alpha male, so let's go with Byronic hero. So someone like that kind of almost like steps into the frame, and you can picture the hero shot. And again, without spoilers, I think it's about 2/3 of the way through, or halfway, or 2/3 of the way through Testament, you get that moment where he appears, the Silk character appears, wearing his big coat and looking tall and everything like that. You've got Tom West in Wild and True Relation. Obviously, debate raging about who would win in a fight between Tom West and James Bond. I know it came up at one of your book launches. And I'm still undecided myself. Big a Bond fan as I am, Tom West, would definitely give us good hits. But then obviously you've got Bond, that Byronic hero who has kind of has had such an impact on people's lives, but he's now actually missing. So I do wonder if that's definitely a thread, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're totally right. And he was very much that well, in some ways he was a contradiction. On the one hand, George was a very kind of patriarchal figure. As I said, lots of daughters, lots of women in his family, incredibly powerful women in his family. He was married to very powerful women. So I don't say patriarchal as in oppressive, but he was the kind of father figure to a lot of women in his life. But that wasn't a role that always sat easily with him. And he became a father really young, and he lost his father really young. And I think he felt that there was a lot in his life that he wanted to live up to, but he wasn't necessarily emotionally equipped for. And he took a long time to come to terms with some of the trauma in his life, I think. And so in some ways it might be fair to say he was better equipped to be a grandfather than he was a father, that he'd kind of moved through some things by the time we came along. And that contradiction, I think, it actually carries into his screen roles as well, because he, if you Google image him when he was a young man, he was a very handsome man. And so he was cast often in the leading role, and early on he did a lot of romances. But he always said that he felt really uncomfortable in those roles, and he saw himself much more as a character actor, and he wanted to be able to do roles where he could kind of disappear more into the character. And he loved his work in I, Claudius, for example, because it gave him that opportunity. So he always said that in some ways he was kind of grateful that Bond hadn't happened for him, because he wasn't that comfortable with the idea of himself as that Byronic hero, alpha male figure. And he really detested I guess what you would call now kind of toxic masculinity, the idea that men shouldn't love fashion and nature and music and dancing and art and cooking. All of that was so important to him, and he really rejected the idea that wasn't a man's world.
Yeah. Well, on his marriage certificate, didn't it list poet as his occupation?
Yeah, and he always wrote poetry, and he was actually a really beautiful poet, and it's worth reading his memoir as well, and particularly for Bond fans as well, because there's quite a lot in there about his friendship with Noel Coward, who of course is involved in the Bond world.
Yeah.
And we were talking earlier, we were chatting about is George like any of the characters that he plays in Bond? And perhaps he has a little bit of all of them. I think if people read the memoir, he talks there about his various different affairs all through his life, or for most of his life. He did really take his father's parting words quite seriously. But probably the most famous of them was his affair with Brigitte Bardot. And we have in the family the Bardot brooch, which is a brooch that he bought my grandmother Julia as an apology for the affair, which my mum wore to his 70th birthday party at the Garrick. So all of the female power of the family was being represented that night as well. And he was really bound up in his own era, as we say, but also bound up in the history of the film industry at that time, as was Julia. So Julia, my grandmother, was a set and costume designer, and Rosie talked beautifully about that in your conversations. So I'd really encourage people, if you're curious about her work. She did the designs on Moulin Rouge. She was the only woman allowed on John Huston sets for a long time, which of course is its own problem. But she was really a trailblazer, and she's part of that generation, that same generation as Johanna Harwood, actually. And I said this to Johanna Harwood, that if it wasn't for women like her and women like my grandmother Julia, I wouldn't get to do what I get to do now, because they fought those battles, and it's not always a happy ending. They didn't fight them and then yay, equality dawned. They fought them and had truncated and difficult and often heartbreaking careers as well as amazing successes. But because of those battles, I can now walk up those staircases and be in those rooms that before I wouldn't have been welcomed into.
Wow. So let's talk about George's connections with Bond.
Yes, let's.
There are more than perhaps people realize. So, and let's actually start with Bond himself, and then we'll do Captain Benson. And then we'll talk about Hilary Bray. And then I think what will happen is we'll end up coming full circle back to Bond again. So, although if you've already said, George missed out on being Bond in some ways, I've actually read some pieces that said it was the best thing that happened to him, essentially, because he got to do so many more interesting roles. Kind of what you've just alluded to there.
That was
Actually, he wanted to play those character roles, and the characters he does play visually on screen in Bond are they're two very, very different characters. But he could have, and it's impossible to overstate this, really, when Ian Fleming himself is saying that George Baker is his preferred Bond to several people, including the people who would actually go on to make the Bond films. When it's not, there are so many, could have been, would have been Bonds throughout the years. But for me, based on the evidence and everything we've got, George Baker is the one who really came the closest. So
yeah, absolutely.
I don't know if you want to tell the story. I actually didn't know the ins and outs of the story. It's actually been misrepresented in lots of different. So even some of George's obituaries, and George passed away in 2011. Is that correct? So if you go back to the obituaries, you'll find different versions of this story, including the fact that the main contributing factor was he was in contract elsewhere, so it was a scheduling issue and that kind of thing. Based on what I've read, that doesn't seem to really be the main reason why that fight didn't happen. So I don't know if you want to kind of tell the story yourself here, Kim. So obviously, there's no better source than yourself for this. So what
I think we've got George's words as well, haven't we? So I'll hand back over to you in a minute for those. But so he, as I said, he didn't even tell me this when I was growing up, because to him it was, one role among many. But my kind of understanding of it is that he was at a restaurant one night having dinner, and Fleming and Broccoli happened to be in the same restaurant having dinner at a different table. And then Fleming brought him over and pointed to him and said, "That's my Bond," and really wanted him. And I think conversations actually did go quite far down the line. And you're right, that's the sort of story that's followed him through his career, because it is this incredibly iconic role. It was really surreal after he died. There's pros and cons, I guess you could say, to losing a grandfather who's famous. The pro is that you can watch them anytime you want. You can have them back again in some ways. Although that can be difficult too. But the con is that the loss kind of belongs to other people as well. And that can be beautiful because you see, people really appreciated him. But it can be strange as well, because in lots of ways, grief is a very private thing. And I remember after he died, going to the corner shop the next day to get milk, and it was on all the front papers that he died, and the front pages of the newspapers. And on the one hand, that was lovely, but it was also a strange, I don't know, bleeding of worlds. And then I was listening to the radio, and they were talking about his career, and they were all saying, and of course he could have been Bond, and that was sort of funny as well, to have that story from so early on in his career come back again. But you can totally see it when you look at him as a young man, and when you look at his young roles, and especially some of his swashbuckling roles. My favorite is Moonraker, where he plays this very swashbuckling figure who's helping King Charles escape, and he does this forward flip through a window of Laycock Abbey and then lands and then does a sword fight, which when I watched as a kid, I was just like, well, that's the coolest thing in the world. So I can totally see how that conversation came about. But I think you have George's words.
So yeah, I mean, in preparation,
telling the story.
I re-listened to the commentary on Her Majesty's Secret Service, and I didn't even know George was a contributor to that commentary, because the DVD commentaries that John Cork put together, which are excellent, are mostly edited together interview clips, and I'd never actually heard the interview clip. If you want to listen to it yourself, for copyright reasons, we won't replicate the interview here. But if you want to listen to it yourself, go to the scene where Bond goes to the College of Arms, and then just flip the commentary on, and then you'll get George talking for about 3 or 4 minutes, telling his version of events, which is slightly different from the one you said. But obviously, memory is, a malleable thing, isn't it? I can't remember what I did yesterday. Let alone, when those commentaries were recorded, it was like 30 years after the fact. So I'd be more inclined to trust the version that he told you directly rather than the version on DVD commentary. But the spirit of it is exactly the same. So, but according to the DVD commentary, he was at lunch at and if this still exists, I really want to go here. Maybe we'll aim to go. But he was at a restaurant in London, a really nice restaurant called the Mirabelle. So we'll look up later whether that still exists.
Yeah.
I've never been. But he was there with Robert Clark, who was a production executive in the British film industry at the time. And I believe, looking at his list of credits, he probably came to know your grandfather through their work on the Dam Busters together. So your grandfather plays the although Michael Redgrave, is the big name star of that movie. Your grandfather plays the airman who actually releases the bomb which breaks the dam. So if you've never seen the Dam Busters, it's a great classic British war film, but Robert Clark produced that, and he was the chief executive of ABDC, which is the Associated British Picture Corporation. And your grandfather was under contract to him. There were loads of other people who were under contract to Robert Clark, including Audrey Hepburn, for instance. And then apparently Fleming comes over to them while they're having dinner and says, Robert, you've got to do, this is verbatim from your grandfather on that commentary, Robert, you have got to do these James Bond books. And there is James Bond sitting with you.
That's lovely, isn't it?
And then Clark apparently turns around, and I'm not going to replicate the Scottish accent, which your grandfather does beautifully on the DVD commentary.
I bet he does.
But Robert Clark was Scottish himself. So Robert Clark said to Fleming, they'll never make films of your books. So,
oh no.
Yeah. So according to
you'd be so embarrassed, wouldn't you?
So
that's terrible. And my understanding is that, that's so funny. My understanding is that Broccoli, I think, was with Fleming at the, they were chatting away, but who knows? But George was in a 6-picture deal at the time, I think. And he, to my knowledge, he asked them, can I get out of it? And they said, no, you can't. And then Connery appeared, and the moment was gone. But I think that Fleming was very serious about it, and as much as I understand it, conversations did go quite far. And when this came around to me, when my agent called me and said the Flemings want to talk to you about writing a Bond novel, I mean, for starters, I thought it was a hoax. But once I realized she was being serious, I thought this is such a beautiful circularity, but it's come back around to the family, especially because George was so fond of the roles that he did end up taking on in Bond, and was really, I think, proud to be part of that legacy.
There is a slight addendum to this story, which George also shares on the commentary, which is really nice.
Yeah.
According to George, Fleming felt so bad about George not being taken forward by Cubby and Harry that apparently Fleming wrote him a letter. So obviously things
Oh.
get lost over the years, but at some point your grandfather received a letter from Ian Fleming himself.
Oh, and imagine if I'd found that. It was me who went through all of his papers after he died, and I didn't find it. So I think had it been there, I would have. Gosh,
And apparently the gist
imagine
of
if we
this
found
letter,
that now.
according to your grandfather on the commentary, he summed it, the letters main thread as when a writer suggests an actor they don't want to know. So Fleming's take on it was, because I suggested you, they're really not interested in my decisions.
Yeah, that rings a bell as a writer. Often the least important in the room. Yeah, so funny. That's so funny. Well, I'll see if we can find that somewhere. After he died, and I was going through all of his papers, I found all of the little poems and letters and things that I'd written to him. All of my kind of juvenilia that I hadn't known he'd kept. So it was really lovely that he kind of had all these boxes for all of his grandchildren, and he'd kept everything. So it might be that he was too loving a grandfather, and there was no space for Fleming's letter. It simply had to go. But I'll have another rummage, see if I can find it.
He seems quite rueful about it, if that's the right word. He's almost like no regrets when he talks about it on the commentary, because obviously he went on to have this, incredible career subsequently. And as you say, the roles that defined him in I, Claudius, Inspector Wexford, those really iconic roles.
Yeah.
But I think his summation on the DVD commentary is that he found himself, he said it was an extraordinary thing, considering his own almost history with being Bond, for him to, we'll come to this when we talk about Hilary Bray later on, but that he was in a position where he was actually voicing Bond for a substantial section of the film. So he found it quite surreal in that sense, to ask to be brought in after a Bond film had been shot to be the voice of James Bond.
Yeah, absolutely. So surreal. And he's Bond's voice for, what is it?
I reckon it's 40 about
minutes
40 minutes of the film that he's, it's not just in the early part of the film as well. His voice comes back, which is one of my favorite parts of the film later on, but we'll come to that in due course.
Yes. I think it was very surreal for him. And then to come back again later as Benson as well. So it kept kind of returning to him, this franchise. And I think he always felt he didn't regret not being Bond, because, like I said, I think he saw himself much more as a character actor, and he was, delighted with the roles that had come to him. And I think there's also probably, as an actor, that's just part of your career, that there'll be so many kind of near things. But the spy genre remained really important, not only in his affiliation with the Bond films, but one of the last roles that he had was a character in Spooks, which an episode I'd really recommend if anybody is a fan of George and wants to look that up. He plays a Russian spy who is returning home after a long time, having been locked up in Britain, I think. And there's this incredibly moving scene where he comes back home to his wife, who hasn't seen him for many decades, and they're singing together. I think it's to the Russian national anthem, and it's really moving. And one of my favorites of his roles. It was just one episode, but it's beautiful. And he received a letter after that from a Russian spy who said to him, that's exactly what it feels like returning home after decades in prison for spying. So I remember him saying to me, well, this is one of the weirdest letters I've ever got after, appearing on, a fan letter, I guess, fan letter from a spy. So yeah, he was quite pleased with that one.
And before we really get stuck into Bond, and one of my favorite roles of your grandfather's is in The Prisoner. So I love the Patrick McGowan, basically kind of his creation, that series where he plays number 2 as well. And I know that, the main character in that's the spy, but he's essentially the antagonist for that episode. So yeah, spying and your grandfather have perhaps more connections than maybe even you realize for the moment until you get into those archives.
Yeah. Absolutely. The funny thing is, and I do think it's in the family history as well. I feel kind of almost certain about it. But George himself then was in the army because of national service and absolutely hated it. So I doubt that he was off spying. He had just married Julia and then had to go off to South Korea. And his letters to her from South Korea are so beautiful, but so sad. And he, as I said, he'd really detested school, and he detested the English class system, and he detested snobbery and bullying, and he found all of those things in the army. His accent he'd learnt very well, and because of who his father had been, but didn't feel, and he talked about this all through his life. I remember as a very old man him saying to me how foolish he felt as in his early 20s, being an officer to veterans of World War II who were, to sergeants and so on, and corporals, and the idea of him giving them orders, and just how hideous he found the whole thing, and that he was desperate to get out, and desperate for the national service to be over. So I don't think in that sense he would have enjoyed being a spy. But I have always wondered about, he went to Moscow during détente with the Royal Shakespeare Company. There was an exchange of theatre troupes, and the Russians came to London, and we went to Moscow, and in the 1980s, I think. And this seems to me prime spying opportunity. And actually, he gave me this. This is a Cold War era leaflet for Moscow, which he gave me when I went to Russia. I went to Russia on a school trip, bizarrely. It was a subsidized state school trip, which my grandparents paid for me to go on, to Russia. It was very peculiar in lots of ways. But George gave me this. Say again?
Child spies, Kim? Is something?
Yes, well, I am named after a child spy, Rudyard Kipling's Kim. But this leaflet begins, "In tourist greets you in Moscow, the capital city of the Soviet state." So it was a little bit out of date, but I loved that George gave it to me, and I loved imagining him there, possibly spying, definitely acting, in détente era Soviet Union.
From what you and Rosie have shared about your grandfather, she talks. You've mentioned he was a member of the Garrick Club. But according to your sister, that didn't really chime with his political sensibilities.
No.
He was very much a socialist, but at the same time, he realized it was really advantageous for his career. So in a sense, are we saying that he was a bit like, this might be a bit too reductive, but I think one of the big appeals of the Bond character, for instance, is that he's both a part of the establishment and apart from the establishment. He has that duality to him, so he can fit in, he can blend in, which you could say of any spy, but they also realize they are an outsider in lots of different ways.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really fair assessment of George, that he was an outsider to life in England, to the class system, to our education system, and he learned it as he would learn a role, and he did it really well. He did it really convincingly, but I don't think he ever felt like an insider himself. But he had this. I remember doing a project for my English A-level. We had to write a textbook. God knows why. Learning instructional language, I suppose, or something. And I decided to write a textbook on the history of 20th century literature. Because I really knew how to have fun as a teenager. So I decided it was on the history of 20th century poetry, and I was going to write a textbook on that. And I went down to stay with him because he had this amazing book collection. And I remember him saying to me, "Now, darling, if we're going to do this, we don't want to be facetious about it." And I remember thinking, I don't know what facetious means, but I'm sure I don't want to be it. And he said, you've got to take it seriously. If they want you to write a textbook on washing machines, and you're being a cheeky young sod and instead writing a textbook on the history of poetry, you've got to get it right. And so really that week I was staying with him, teaching me the history of poetry in the 20th century. And that was his attitude, I think, to not necessarily, I wouldn't say a persona, but his attitude to his Englishness and his attitude to acting was, well, if you're going to do it, get it right. So he really embodied that role. It's not that it was false or fake, but he, I think, also stood a little bit on the outside of it and looked at it with a raised eyebrow. So yes, he was a member of things like the Garrick Club, but he would go there and try and persuade them to let women in and rail against the snobbery of it all. So he was an interesting contradiction in some ways.
And then the last thing that I'm going to bring up before we kind of get stuck into his Bond roles is he was a fellow MBE recipient. So being part of the establishment,
yes, he was.
sense,
yes,
as much as I'm part of the establishment,
yes.
Yeah. So
yes.
got an MBE.
Well, perhaps you're changing what the establishment means.
Well, that's my line I'm going with as well. Don't get me wrong, I'm very, very proud to be a recipient of a belong to the Order of the British Empire, which sounds, even though the order's only been in existence since 1917, it sounds like something that goes back, eons or something, doesn't it? But it sounds very, very fancy, I know, and I'm very proud to be a recipient. But was your grandfather proud to be a recipient for his charitable works, not his acting specifically, wasn't he?
He was enormously proud because it was for his charity work, raising money to get MRI machines into hospitals in the Southwest and building youth centres. So, and his work with disadvantaged children. So that was something that he felt hugely passionate about his whole life. And I think he felt really proud that that was the recognition. And it was a nice kind of thing to share in a way. I went to the palace when I was how old was I? About 22. Because I was studying creative writing at UEA, which is this kind of famous institution for creative writing here in the UK. For American listeners, it's like the equivalent of Iowa. And the course was given a medal for impact on society, and I was chosen as an ambassador from the program to go down to the palace and accept the medal. And I'm from a good anarchic socialist family, and so in some ways, this idea of the establishment is a funny one. But going down there and thinking of George there, and thinking, oh, this was the room where he got his medal. And thinking how proud he was of that, I really kind of cherished that moment of connection, because he'd just passed away when I went down there. So that was a lovely moment to kind of feel his presence with me, and I've kept feeling his presence kind of every step of the way with my writing. He didn't live to see me publish a book, but I feel like he is with me anyway, and particularly because the Bond community so loves his characters, even though they're these, in some ways, these kind of secondary characters or these guest starring moments. Just how fond people are of him means that his memory is with me a lot on this incredible, surreal adventure that I'm on with the world of Bond.
No, that's really lovely. So this is what we're going to do. This is your idea. So all credit to you here, Kim. What we're going to do is we're going to watch his 2 on-screen appearances in the Bond films. The Spy Who Loved Me, we're going to start with that one as Captain Benson. He appears in a couple of scenes, and then as Hilary Bray, we're actually going to watch a couple of scenes, one of which where only his voice appears, and then we're going to we watch those separately and then come back and kind of talk about those. So if you want to watch the scenes, pause it, and then kind of come back to us talking about that. That's probably the best way to do it. Before we begin, I am just going to flag up that allegedly there is another appearance of George Baker in a Bond film earlier than both of those, and that is in You Only Live Twice. So Kim and me are going to set you a challenge. Can you, because we can't, can you find George Baker on screen in You Only Live Twice? I have gone through that film frame by frame before we recorded this. Every scene. Apparently, he's a NASA technician, but I also had a look to see whether he was essentially the US government, whether he was a Soviet technician. So, or any of the scenes where there are kind of group scenes. I've gone through and I've tried to find him. There's a couple of candidates' backs of heads, but nothing that I could really pin down and say, yes, that's definitely George. But it is, in whatever source you look at, it is reported that George, and from what I understand, he acknowledged himself that he did work on You Only Live Twice, but maybe didn't make the final cut, or at least
I don't know, because he, as I was saying, he was an extremely tall man, so he would very much stand out in any of those scenes, but the credit is there. So yes, listeners, screenshot him for us if you manage to find him.
Yeah, it's frustrating the heck out of me, to be perfectly honest. I am, as you know, Kim, I am one of those completists. I have every edition of Double or Nothing known to mankind. It's like, so yeah, I do want to collect them all, to use the parlance of Pokemon. I would really, really like to be able to find where he is in You Only Twice. So every time I watch the film, I go, "Oh, there's George." So if people want to point him out, please feel free to do so, because I am at a complete loss. But
yes.
fortunately, a lot easier to spot in The Spy Who Loved Me, which is where we're going to start. So if you want to fire up your DVD or whatever version of the film, we're going to do the same, and then we'll come back and have a talk about his performance in that film in just a minute. Right, we've moved location to the lounge. Well, our respective lounges.
We were just saying we've never actually watched a Bond film together, which seems like a crime.
I know.
So this is almost that.
It is. Which one would we go for, do you think?
Oh, I think that we would waste the whole evening discussing which one to watch, and we never get around to it.
So I'm on brand with, admittedly not Spy Who Loved Me, which is what we're about to watch, but with Bond. You've got The Big Sleep, which is both one of my favorite books and one of my favorite films. So yeah.
Me too.
Yeah, great stuff. Right, so what we're going to do is we're going to watch the first I think it's about 10-15 minutes where Captain Benson appears in The Spy Who Loved Me. So if you want to play along, if you haven't already watched the sequence yourself, we're going to initiate mission. I'm going to turn my volume off just in case it's slightly off and we get weird feedback and stuff. But are you ready to
yes, and folks,
there you go.
Xbox controls at the ready. If you
I'm on PlayStation. There you go. One of the two. Yeah.
If you want to watch with us, David will count down from 3, and we'll synchronize our watches and watch the first 10 minutes or so. Okay.
So 1, 2, 3, or 3, 2, 1.
Oh, this is very Lethal Weapon.
Yes. That's exactly what that is. Okay, let's do 3, 2, 1. Okay. 3, 2, 1. I'm still on the MGM Lion here. I'm not in sync, but we'll get.
Hang on. Shall I pause? Wait for you to catch up.
No.
Roger Moore's trousers are very flared, aren't they?
They are. They're very flared in this one.
Yeah.
That's it. I'm just speeding up slightly. 1.5 speed. He's walking very, very quickly, like Buster Keaton or Charlie Chaplin. There you go. There we go. Submarine crew. Loads of these actors actually appear in subsequent Bond movies, including that guy at the front. So
I like how it's almost like a Shakespearean troupe. You keep getting the same actors through.
Yeah. So Georgie's not the only person who reappears.
Yeah.
Obviously, he's got a speaking role. That's Jeremy Bulloch at the front, who plays Boba Fett in Star Wars. Sorry, I'm like this every time I watch a film with Star
Yes, of course it is. Yeah. And then we have the storm in a teacup image.
That's it. Some nice product placement from HP Sauce, if I remember, flying up off the table or something. Or is that Tomorrow Never Dies? This is very Tomorrow Never Dies. I know you love Tomorrow Never Dies as well, but
I do. And that's the amazing thing about the lasting nature of Bond, that it can reference itself in such a deep way.
Indeed.
No, there's been no contact with Reggie yet. No. No sightings, no distress signals. It looks very much like it. Yes, of course, please. We've lost one of our nuclear submarines.
Dun, dun, dun.
So we were talking about accents. That sort of posh register of George's voice there is much posher than he really sounded in everyday life. And then in Wexford, people will know him for a West Country accent. It's completely different. And he would keep that West Country accent when he was doing interviews on the news about Wexford, because he didn't want to sort of break people out of it. So for me as a kid, he had this kind of chameleon voice that could be anything.
It is. Yeah, I love these.
Yeah.
I love the gender, the play on gender here, because you assume that incredibly attractive and very hairy backed Michael Billington.
And I love the hairy back as a kind of, almost feels to me like they're being a bit flirtatious and they're saying, is it Sean Connery? It might be. Oh, no, it's not.
Good Lord, he's an attractive man though, isn't he? And obviously, Barbara Bach, Mrs. Ringo Starr is obviously very attractive as well. But yeah.
I wonder if actors like this, where they're playing the sort of Bond, it was frustrating, or whether it was a fun chance to kind of show, look how good I'd be in the role.
I think Billington actually was one of those, not as close as George, but I think he was one of those names that was in the running for quite some time.
And I love that sort of flip, and actually she's the agent, and I think that's one of the best things in this film. Moneypenny.
Well, quite.
Here he is.
One of my favorite exchanges. I cannot find the words. Have you ever read the novelization of this film written by the screenplay? It's such a like dark and twisted version of the story. Like that character, she ends up being murdered by the Soviets, and her body crammed into the wardrobe or so. Oh no, the person that Bond was supposed to meet. So he finds a dead body there. So it's all very sinister. It's not played for laughs like this.
Yeah. I like his ticker tape watch though.
Yeah, I love this. So does England.
So does England.
Also, the yellow and red outfit.
Oh yeah, I know. Why not go dressed as a hot dog? You know.
Message received. They are waiting.
We didn't know we were in the 70s by now. We do.
Yes. Yeah, the flared trousers weren't the clue in the beginning.
It's occurred to me, I know your grandfather hasn't come back into the film yet, but he will shortly after the title sequence. He's like one of the few like straight men characters in this film, and I don't mean that just in terms of sexual orientation. I mean in
Yeah.
kind of like he's the one playing it seriously. He's the one who
Yes.
anchors the drama. It's like, oh, we've just lost one of our nuclear submarines. He has to
Yes.
he had to deliver that line with such like a straight face. And I don't know how you go about delivering lines like we've just lost one of our nuclear submarines with a straight face.
Yes. Well, it's almost like he's acting in a different film because
Yeah.
he's delivering the line with the gravitas of the situation. And then we have Roger Moore's brilliant irony and raised eyebrow.
Yeah, it's a totally different register, isn't it? Which I think the Bond films always do. They have those sublime, silly, and then, you know, quite serious moments as well, quite nasty, sadistic moments sometimes. But yeah, your
And I
grandfather.
think this film is a good example of that balance of tones.
Yeah.
Because Roger Moore, yes, he's perhaps known as the kind of more ironic, lighter touch Bond. This is an amazing shot as he glides down through the air, isn't it?
Have you had the chance to meet John Glenn yet? Who was the guy who? Okay, so you know, yeah,
amazing.
Yeah.
So yeah, this film, and this is a great example of it, combines the gravitas of that beautiful shot with the Union Jack opening, which is so wonderfully silly in lots of ways.
Yeah.
So it's got a great mixture of tones.
This film's great for what we were talking about earlier about British identity and what it means to be British, and clearly,
Yes.
you know, jumping completely incognito off a ski slope with a Union flag parachute.
Well, people shoot at you.
So I've just thought actually, so Lewis Gilbert directed You Only Twice, which was where your grandfather was first on a Bond set, and then came back to direct this one and Moonraker. So
Right.
I wonder if he had a particular connection. I know that your grandfather lived near to Peter Hunt, the director of On Her Majesty's Secret Service, but I wonder if got to know Lewis through Peter or if he knew Lewis. Do you know anything about that?
I don't know, but I wouldn't be surprised if he knew him through Peter Hunt.
I think his name.
And I think he really enjoyed working with Roger Moore. I think he enjoyed his company.
Yeah. Sorry, I've started singing unconsciously. No one needs to hear that. So you listen to Bond themes while you write. Is that still the case? I know that's what you put in the afterword / acknowledgements of 009.
It is. And if anybody's watching this on YouTube, the expression that just came over my face was an almost Pavlovian response to this song. I forget to think about the scene I'm in the middle of, because I listen to the music just on repeat when I'm writing. And I'm writing book 3 at the moment, and I have an imminent deadline. So it's blasting constantly from my study at the moment. I love this song. This is maybe my favorite. Well, is it it's my favorite love song of the series.
I can't remember who pointed it out. It might be on that documentary, but someone said, oh, it might actually. I think it was David Arnold himself. He's been one of our in the 007 GB club. One of our board members. She's interviewed him, and I think it was in that. But he said this is the only show tune of any Bond songs, and I only kind of realized that recently. Is because obviously Marvin Hamlish, you know, chorus line and all that.
Yeah,
but, yeah.
Because so I listen to them on Spotify, and you know how the algorithm reads what you're listening to and then suggests other things. It reads the Bond music as what it calls British standards easy listening. So then it's always like, would you like more easy listening? Like, pick up the common denominator.
I love this set. It was apparently inspired by Eisenstein. So yeah, Ken Adam went full on Russian for this one.
Yeah.
Again, a very, very serious scene after what
Yes.
we've just seen. It
Yeah.
like just back down, doesn't it, dramatically?
Yeah. She gives a great performance.
She's very good, isn't she? I don't know if that's her voice or if she's dubbed, actually. I'm feeling it's one of those things I should know, but obviously throughout the 60s, basically any Bond girl, apart from Hannah Blackman, was dubbed over, usually
Yes.
by the same person. But I think
Yes,
that
you couldn't dub Honor Blackman some of the most iconic delivery in any film dialogue. Little boys too.
Yes. But being as we're going to be talking about dubbing with Honor Majesties, it's really interesting how much of those early Bond films, and obviously the dubbing in Honor Majesties is so good. If you weren't listening out for George's voice, you could perhaps think that was the other George Lazenby.
Yes.
In those scenes. So here we go. We're about to see Captain Benson. Do we know why he was called back? Was it just because they enjoyed working with him the first time?
I think so.
Mm.
See how tall George is here. Because Roger Moore was tall himself.
Yeah. I did notice, sticking with our tweed theme, I'm pretty sure Q's wearing tweed in this scene. So he stands out against everybody else in the scene because they're wearing rather more traditional, Bond actually in his navy uniform and everyone else is in really dark suits. Whereas Q is wearing what looks like grey tweed anyway. But yeah, your grandfather has to do basically all of the exposition in this scene.
Yes.
And make us believe it. Yeah, which is certainly a skill. Yes. Very gruff and very serious.
Where did this come from? I'm sorry, Benson, for the moment that's top secret. Commander, this tracing means the Russians can track our nuclear submarines underwater and sink them. I believe it does. But how could they track them? It's impossible. No, it's quite simple. Heat signature recognition, most likely. With your permission, Minister? Yes, good. Thank you. Well, you see, we already know that satellites with infrared heat sensors can detect a nuclear...
It's a lovely tweed suit Q has.
Isn't it? See what I mean? Constantly just distracted by tweed now. Ruined Bond for me.
That means they can totally undermine our Western defense strategy. It looks like it, yes. Where in fact did we get this present, Bray? Car, diplomatic bag.
This is probably one of my... We'll pause. Should we pause it here? And
yeah,
this is one of my favorite shots in all of Bond, though. Like with that nuclear... What other film series could you have a nuclear submarine perfectly timed in the background while you deliver exposition in the foreground? It's crazy.
Absolutely.
Yeah, let's pause there and talk about Captain Benson then. So how did that character, you mentioned it earlier, how did that character sort of compare with your granddad? Do you think he would have enjoyed having to be that kind of serious for a role?
Yes, I say he it's lovely watching him actually, and seeing the things that I recognize to be George, or movements that George made. Particularly when he was opening the door, they kind of drummed a little bit with his fingers, and he was a really beautiful dancer. Big man, but kind of very light on his feet, and there was something about that movement that reminded me of him dancing. And then the bits that were very different from him, because he was a great storyteller and raconteur and very, very funny and big gestures and lots of laughter. So being such a sort of still and buttoned up man, that's very different from him. I also found it interesting what he was doing with or how they've kind of set the scene. In a lot of the shots, he's almost the vanishing point of the scene. He's standing, as it were, in the middle of them all. So your eyes going to him, but then he's looking at Bond. So it's almost as if the camera's going to George, but then George is going to Bond. So moving your attention on to how does this exposition impact on our hero, which is the important part for us as the audience. and carrying the gravitas of the moment. But that would mean they could sink our subs, which Roger Moore applies to with a kind of wry eyebrow. So again, it's that balance of tones which we were talking about, which this film does so well. So yeah, lovely to watch it. And I remember actually after he died, pretty quickly after he died, I tried to watch this film because I was missing him so much. And then I got to that scene and I just had to stop, and I just couldn't. I just found it too upsetting. But it's with time it becomes a gift, because they come back to you again, so you can enjoy seeing the bits of the actor that are things that you recognize from them as a person, and then appreciate the performance as well, and appreciate the craft and the artistry of it, which is really lovely.
No, that is lovely.
Now I want to watch the rest of the film, though.
Yeah, I know, that's the only problem, isn't it? But we've got On a Majesty Secret Service to move on. So let's get those DVDs fired up. Just remember which chapters they are. I think it's going to be.
Don't you just love DVD menus? The nostalgia of a good DVD menu.
You've actually got the DVDs that have really great menus. I'm so sad. I can tell that just from
and they have the activate button, which just always makes me happy.
I'm on the Blu-ray versions, which have the most boring menus. Should have got my old DVDs out.
So you'll have to tell me where we're heading.
Yeah, I looked it up earlier when I I actually struggled to find this. For some reason, even though I've seen this film incalculable numbers of times, the placement of Hilary Bray scene is a bit odd. Because I remember where he is in the novel. So yeah, the chapter we want, or let me just check before we commit to this.
We should do well, folks, tell us if you'd be at all interested in this. We should do a watch along with people.
Yeah, that would be absolutely brilliant. Okay, so it's chapter.
That'd be fun.
George is actually the image on chapter 12 of the DVD. So
there he is. Yes. And so this is George a bit younger.
Yes. So this is 19.
So the George, the George that we just saw in The Spy Who Loved Me is a very familiar look to me for George. That's kind of how he looked when I was little. And then, going grayer and everything. But this George isn't the George that is one I knew, if you see what I mean, kind of visually.
So, and then I think the other scene we're going to watch is where it's that front door. I don't know what's going on there. Someone's at the front door.
Did a robot just tell you someone's at your front door?
Yeah, it did. Our house is basically like my version.
Q-Branch.
Yeah, it is like Q-Branch, which, as you know me, Kim, I'm not the biggest fan of technology. Whereas Anthony is. So he's the reason I can't even get the lights to turn on sometimes. We'll leave him doing that. Right, so we're going to watch chapter 12, which is obviously where we see George on screen. And then I think what we do, we decide how much of that. I think after then, when it kind of does that kind of crash cut or whatever to. In fact, should we watch Bond in the helicopter?
Yeah.
Because I love that line delivery George. And then we'll skim ahead to the first love scene. And you might want to give us some context for that as we go.
Folks will hear you'll hear George's voice through this film at various points. As we said, he's Bond. He's the voice of Bond, we could say, for a lot of this film.
Definitely the voice of Bond. Yeah. So let's go with chapter 12. I'm counting. I'll count down again. Keep it consistent. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. You.
As long as you're the same chapters as me, because I'm on a Blu-ray version and I've got those DVDs. But does it? What's the first image you get when you get to chapter 12?
Very beautiful car.
Very beautiful car. I think that we are on the same page because I think it's Bond. That might be an issue. Hold on a second. So yeah, is it Bond's car turning into M's house? Is there like
I think so.
Yeah, okay. That should work. Yep. Ready?
Okay, count us
3,
in.
2, 1. Yeah, from the music cue, we're in the right place.
Yep. Very nice house.
Yeah. Exactly as Fleming describes it in the book.
Yeah. So is that a Rolls Royce? Whose was that on set, do you think?
Oh, I don't know. It's not Cubby's because that's the one that's in Goldfinger.
Yeah.
Is that the one in Goldfinger? It's definitely in A View to... No, it's in A View to a Kill. Cubby's Rolls Royce in A View to a Kill. Oh, I love the scene. A green velvet jacket that M
I
wears.
was just thinking. Yeah.
I want one.
Yes. You and Rosie should do an episode on Velvet next.
Oh my gosh, yes. In fact, I think Anthony has a green velvet jacket somewhere. I might borrow it. I love that M is into butterflies or lepidoptera.
Of course. And that he's also kind of affronted that Bond has the knowledge.
Mm.
Came across a letter from the Bruder Gumbo solicitors in Switzerland to a certain Count Balthazar de Blochon.
Emmy's dressed in kind of such a foppish manner. I think that's probably
It's
the right word. That cravat and everything else. So different to what
Yeah.
we usually see.
Yes.
With the request that they undertake to establish the Blochon's claim to the title.
Okay, College of Arms,
Bray, he's the Sable Bedford College.
the real College of Arms. Nice report.
Now, I've already taken the liberties of working with the college on this, using an examination of my own family tree as cover. I've also been reading up on the technical side of heraldry.
I've also been reading up on the technical side of heraldry.
Oh no, as you do. I love how Fleming, just because this is very close to the novel, obviously, but I love Fleming poured all of his research into the book. So he's like, I've got into heraldry, so Bond is into heraldry.
Yeah.
Here he is.
Good motto, eh? The world is not enough. You've been doing splendid, John. Thank you, Mr. Sable Basilisk. Here's your line back to Slaughter and Bond. The man with Wickham's brew by a night's fee from the other planet, 1387. We're in luck. Gumbo's telephone from Bern to say that his...
I love that little moment there where Hilary Bray doesn't trust the person.
Yes.
And actually, there's a deleted scene, which I'd love to see, where it's revealed that guy is actually a villain listening in at the door. And then they were supposed to shoot a foot chase. So there's probably some footage of George in the Eon archive somewhere we've never seen.
Where do I go for this meeting?
I think a bit canny about that. They don't just have a description of myself. Tactfully adjusted for
Description.
They would send the time and place from where
The enunciation is... Yeah.
Yes.
Not our sort of thing, but under the circumstances.
I'll tell you a good story about that in a minute.
Okay. It's such a weird scene with him voicing both characters at the same time.
And he could throw his voice to the back of a theatre. So it's almost like he's doing that. He's throwing his voice into Lazenby's mouth.
I hope I can live up to your high standards.
Those very twinkly eyes are very George.
It's not the sort of thing we allow, of course. But it could
And we alone.
And you might try and buy them into out there. But the Blochons have been coming from there for generations.
Yes, if he is our man, I'd like to get a boy from Switzerland.
Yeah, I do like that turn from he's got the research, he's got the Bond's family history, and we get that lovely "the world is not enough" moment, and then he goes into everything he's found out, and I like this idea of it's quite a sort of old-fashioned idea that everybody in the British establishment is a spy of some order or another. Everybody will be called upon for a favour and will be pretty good at it, which is this idea that I think goes back to the real history of the Secret Service being this quite amateurish thing to begin with, running on the goodwill of gentlemen. What I was going to say about the enunciate thing is George used to, when I was little and I'd be telling a story at the dinner table, he used to go, enunciate, and make the cutlery jump with each beat of his fist, which taught me to enunciate in interviews. So it's funny seeing him now, kind of schooling Lazenby on enunciation.
And throughout, obviously, we're going to let this scene play on a little bit before we skip forward, because there are just some brilliant lines in here where it's almost like Bond as Bray, like even amps up the character's stuffiness to another level. So he's got this impression of what Bond is like. Sorry, of what Bray was like from his initial meeting. You know, a guy who to go and, you know, his idea of a good time is going to do some brass rubbings in some churches. That's no offense to any avid brass rubbers out there. But you know, each to their own. But it's very clear that the character is being presented as this antithesis to Bond. You know, they don't have interests in common. Let's put it that way.
And that Bond is young and cool and the 60s, and that Bray is supposed to be very much the opposite of that, with his tweed and love of history and that kind of the connotations of tweed being so fusty, as you and Rosie were discussing.
I love some of the line delivery, like, it's not our sort of thing. You know, we could possibly countenance this deception. You know, the diction compared to Bond's. You know, Bond is not inarticulate himself, but it's so over the top. The vocabulary he's given, and he relishes every single word.
And we should perhaps explain for those who don't know that it's George doing Lazenby's impression of him.
That's correct. So
is that a good way to describe it?
Totally. So apparently, yes. So Lazenby recorded. In fact, I found this on the DVD commentary. Peter Hunt himself said that to his recollection, they recorded all the scenes, well, most of the scenes with Lazenby as Bray earlier in the schedule. So that if Lazenby was, because he wasn't a trained actor, if he was nervous on set, then that nervousness would play into his portrayal of Bray, because Bray's not as confident as Bond. So I'm not sure that really comes through on the film, to be honest, because Bond still looks
a good performance.
Yeah, I think so too. I think Bond is still uber confident here. But it's interesting that that was a consideration. It was almost like a contingency in case. Like in the edit, pretend it was just him being nervous because he was playing somebody else. But to be fair to George Lazenby, this is having your early scenes where you're not an actor, where you're having to impersonate another character on top of the character that you are playing. That's a big...
Yeah, even harder. And I think he struggled with George's accent or voice. So George ended up dubbing these scenes where Lazenby is pretending to be Bray. So everything you hear here is actually George's voice. And it's very surreal to me, because I know George's voice so well, even when it's different from his own. I know his intonations and his emphasis. So to hear my grandfather's voice come out of George Lazenby's mouth has just always been so surreal. And probably one of the reasons that actually this is a film I don't know as well as I know some of the others, because I just find it such a surreal thing.
I think it is so well done, though, the dubbing, that it is. Unless you knew, you wouldn't know that that was George Baker's voice, unless you knew George Baker's voice already. And obviously, you live in Britain, you know George Baker's voice because of Wexford and everything else. You've never seen a Bond film. So if you were coming to this film fresh, you'd go, that's George Baker's voice carrying on through the next 40 minutes. But if you didn't have that context, you would think it was George Lazenby impersonating Hilary Bray.
Yes.
I love these lines here about, you know, even when I'm at my best, you know, Bray's such a sportsman. He's not remotely physical compared with Bond. So is that something that's kind of, which one of those is kind of closer to your grandfather?
We live in a world of opportunity. So George was a real lover of horse riding. So he was a very kind of physical man in that way. And actually his turning point really in aging was when he fell from his horse and broke his shoulder, and after that he very much kind of seemed old for the first time. He didn't really like much other sports, to my knowledge. My mum would be able to tell you more, but horse riding was a huge love of his all of his life.
Yeah. One of my favorite scenes in this is when he has a go at curling and flies across the ice, you know, just Bond having to pretend to be completely inept at any
Yes.
people. It's just such a brilliant, it's such
Yeah.
a move, actually, isn't it? For
It is.
a third of a Bond film to show
Yeah.
Bond being a bit rubbish.
Being not Bond. And it's almost in a way an additional challenge for Lazenby, and does no favors to him
Yes, good point.
for his first ever film, because he hasn't had a chance to cement himself. So say, for example, when we see Roger Moore in the clown suit,
Yeah.
we know Moore so well, we love him so much that we really take that in our stride. But this is a challenge as an actor, I would think, to try and establish yourself as this iconic tough guy.
Definitely. Shall
While
we've seen.
Yes, sorry, I'm just watching the film now.
I know, we're just watching the film now, aren't we? He's great. Yeah.
Yeah, so you tell me where to head next.
Yeah, shall we head to let's head to pop-up menu. Yeah, this is I do feel a little bit nervous, Kim, saying let's skip ahead to the love scene, considering we're going to hear your grandfather's voice in a love scene. And when you initially messaged me and said there's a family story about this, isn't there, before we get to said love scene with Ruby Barr?
Yes, so
Go on.
you'll hear it's it's George's voice in the love scenes when there's dialogue in bed, in this section of the film.
Okay.
Who knows exactly why? Possibly his form with Brigitte Bardot and others. They thought he'd be more winning in these scenarios. But that's my understanding, and yes, it's a surreal thing. I mean, I used to find that watching Wexford as well, because he's quite old in Wexford. But this my grandmother Louis played Dora Wexford, played his wife on Wexford. And there's quite a lot of scenes of them, being very loving and romantic and kissing, and I, I'd watch that as a kid and be like, oh,
Yeah.
why did they play that TV?
What are you doing?
Yeah.
Right. So that thing where, everyone has that thing where they watch their parents or grandparents, and they go, oh God, get a room kind of thing. You had that on TV.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, and then the next day my English teacher at school would say, oh, your grandfather, guy's gorgeous. Like, oh, don't tell me that.
Oh my God. So I'm really nervous about telling us to go to chapter 17 then.
Chapter 17, here we go.
We're about to watch George Lazenby, who is a very fine figure of a man himself.
Indeed.
With his shirt off in this scene as well. Yes, but voiced by your grandfather. So hopefully this isn't going to be too weird. Okay.
Let's find out. Okay, do you want to count us in?
I'm really nervous. Okay. 3, 2, 1.
The ruff is quite a thing to behold, isn't it, in his costuming? Is that a ruff even? It's a Beau Brummel waterfall.
Looking very studious here.
Yes. You can see why they cast him.
Yeah, definitely. I've never bought that he's, I suppose it was people coming from Connery who would, kind of, they are very different. But yeah. I've always bought Lazenby as Bond.
Yeah. And it's a bold move at the time. We accept it now because of the success of the Bond franchise, because of things like Doctor Who, because of the MCU, this idea of because of Batman regenerating a character. But
Yeah.
at the time, to have had something so hugely successful and then test whether or not you can achieve it again with an unknown actor is a really bold move.
Yeah. I quite like Bond's ingenuity in this because he's quite, you know, the spy. And so he's having to figure out how to escape from, you know, a room using stationery.
Yeah. I like that he's using his I don't know the word for that pouch on a kilt, but I like that he's using it to.
Sporran. I
There you
think
go.
it's a sporran, yeah.
Sporran.
You're the one
I
who
like that
lives
he's
in
using
Scotland.
gadgets.
You know, you'd think you'd turn
I
native.
know. I've got to get the lingo. And really highlighting these the sliding doors and things, aren't they? The sort of modernity of the set.
Yeah, definitely. This is like hotel goals, though, isn't it? Whenever you check into a hotel, it's like I want it to look like something from a Bond film. Maybe not the whole locking us in rooms thing.
Maybe not.
But I love all the dialogue in this scene about Hilly. What you are so silly, pretending not to like girls. I don't use. Oh, dear.
And the idea of the kind of 60s free love and everything really comes through in this film.
Yeah, totally.
What did I do about chickens? My family's got a chicken farm, and every time I had to do something, I really died. The specialist thought there was this wonderful Swiss clinic where they cured you free because they were researching at the same time.
No, about the clinic, I mean.
Oh. Well, the specialist had me meet Fraulein Boat in London, and she said I had a very interesting case.
How right she was.
How right she was.
It's very George. It's really funny to me.
I'm glad you're finding it funny and not traumatizing.
It's really strange.
Should we pause it there? Because this is like one of the
Yes.
parts of any Bond film. You know
This
what?
is when it gets into very Ipcris file territory.
It is, yeah, the brainwashing. Something's just struck me, and I can't believe I hadn't thought about this before, but actually, George Baker's impersonation of Bond playing Hilary Bray, God, that's confusing, it actually reminds me of the voice of Ian Fleming himself.
Oh, that's really interesting. I never thought that before either, but they are the same, almost the same generation.
It's quite clipped, isn't it? The pronunciation like that.
Yes.
So it is, yeah. And I just remember hearing, if you've never heard Fleming's voice, there's a really great there's just a 7-minute remnant of Desert Island Discs on Radio 4 that was recorded really towards the end of his life. And obviously he's on lots of documentary clips and things like that. But yeah, I do partly wonder whether the direction was to kind of almost sort of ape Fleming's voice a little bit. He's got nothing to substantiate that whatsoever, but hearing that just then, it just made me kind of think of that. And obviously Hilary Bray was the name Hilary Bray, not the character, but the name Hilary Bray was based off one of Fleming's really close friends who he not only went to school with, but he actually arranged his funeral and arranged Fleming's funeral and everything like that. They were close the whole of life. So yeah, I'm not sure what's going on there, but that's something I hadn't thought of before anyway.
That's really interesting. And I wonder if that also comes through because of what we were discussing earlier in terms of George learning an English accent and very deliberately learning the Queen's English, as it was called then, this received pronunciation accent, which you needed as an actor, and which he's doing here as Bray to one level. And then, as you say, I think he even enhances the register when he's being Lazenby being Bray, because Bond is kind of taking the piss a little bit out of what he sees as
Yeah.
Bray's kind of fustiness and old-fashioned nature. So George is really drawing on that received pronunciation accent, which is the accent Fleming would have learnt. Not necessarily, perhaps, I don't know, perhaps the voice he was born with, perhaps the voice that he learnt, as we all do with different accents, to learn how to kind of get on in whatever world we're occupying. So there would be an overlap in that the Queen's English or received pronunciation is a kind of accent uniform for a certain class and background within Britain.
Mm. Yeah. As a linguist, I find it fascinating that we've got an Australian actor playing
Right.
a character who is quintessentially English but really Scottish and Swiss, French.
Yes.
And
Yes.
they are impersonating a Sir Hilary Bray was based on a real Scottish person, but I don't think Hilary Bray's character is supposed to be Scottish. But anyway,
No.
impersonating this stuffy genealogist guy, yeah, it's like mind-blowing, isn't it, really? But
Yeah, it really is. And it's a history of the 20th century and a few people's accents in some ways. And I think that the nature of Bond and his British identity, which was something that you and Rosie discussed in terms of Tweed being synonymous with a certain image of Britishness, and Harris Tweed being synonymous with Scottishness, the accent of Bond that we so often hear is the English accent after Sean Connery. But of course, Connery has his fully working class Scottish accent. And I always think that it's interesting that people often kind of say, "Oh, James Bond, like the quintessential Englishman," and forget the Scottish part, forget the Swiss part. But I think that complexity points to the rich complexity of a British identity. And Fleming himself writes about Bond feeling like an alien on home soil. And that was something I picked up in Double or Nothing, where I talk about Bond being very European. As you say, he's Swiss Scottish. And I think that's something that George would have resonated with as well. His father being English, his mother being Irish, growing up in Bulgaria. There's a internationalism to that moment in history, as well as to our identity throughout history, that sometimes people seek to flatten or simplify and use Bond, I think misuse Bond, to present a one-dimensional idea of Britishness.
Yeah. I think sometimes people think, perhaps it's best symbolized by, the scene we watched before this one. People think that Bond is this national symbol in a simplistic way, like he's the Union flag on a parachute. And obviously there's the contextual reasons for that film. So The Spy Who Loved Me was obviously a Jubilee year. Like Skyfall was a Jubilee year as well. So there is that kind of should we say patriotic, not jingoistic, but patriotic kind of sense. But as any sensible, rational person knows, that's just a flag on a parachute. Actually, British identity is just so much more complex than that. And I wonder if that is something, because Fleming was so adamant, really, that your grandfather should play Bond on screen. I wonder if that was something that Fleming was conscious of.
That's really interesting. Perhaps, and conscious of that. George was younger than Fleming, but both of them had, and I don't know how much Fleming knew this, but both of them had gone through quite similar losses, losing fathers in the war. And I wonder how much they saw a reflection in each other. I'll have to go digging through the family papers again, see if I can find that letter.
If you find the letter, I mean, I really want to read the letter, but I know a lot of other people who will as well. No, that'd be amazing.
This has been so lovely to revisit these with you, and for Sir Hilary Bray Day. And it's such a nice thing that the as I was saying earlier, that the Bond fan community really embraces these kind of secondary characters, and has kept the memory of George really dear to the heart of the community. As Rosie was saying in your conversation with her, it can be both beautiful and in a way a reminder of loss to watch George again. So I don't often return to these films by myself, but it's really lovely watching these clips with you and kind of thinking about him in the wider picture of the Bond story. And I did, before we got on the call, I was going through some old clips of him, and I feel really lucky to have that kind of archive that I can call on when I miss him, and see his see his artistry as well. So I'm looking forward to future Hilary Bray days as well, where we can maybe revisit some other aspects of his career as well.
Yeah, that'd be brilliant. That'd be a real pleasure.
Absolutely.